Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. It's the Oxfam scandal. It's grabbing the headlines everywhere. Senior figures in Oxfam, part of the Haiti mission, using prostitutes on a scale we don't quite yet know. And the one part of this story that I really don't understand fully is there's talk that perhaps there could even be prosecutions, because there's talk that some people there may have been predatory paedophiles. What is clear is we know actually very little about what happened in Haiti or rumours about Chad or elsewhere. So in terms of specifics, we have a problem here. However, it was enough for Penny Lawrence, a Deputy Chief Executive of Oxfam, to resign today her post, saying, over the last few days we've become aware that concerns were raised about the behaviour of our staff in Chad as well as Haiti, and we failed to act adequately upon it. So she's resigned because of that, because this all came to light a few years ago, and very little seemed to be done about it. Now, very interesting. And by the way, I'm not a big fan of Oxfam. Strikes me they're a very politicised charity. If you look at many of the people who've held senior positions, I would almost regard it as an outpost of the Labour Party. But, the fact is, if they are doing good work, then, in the third world and elsewhere, then that's fine. But there's something bigger behind all of this, I sense. And it's very interesting that yesterday, the ex-Development Secretary, Priti Patel, remember, she lost her job after a series of unauthorised visits and missions in Israel, and she talked about a culture of denial that was taking place across the aid world and that had been going on for years, and my ears pricked up at that. And then I listened last night to Tory MP Conor Burns, who's the Commons aide to the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, and he said last night, I believe we are at the tip of an iceberg in finding out what has been going on, and that there has been a systematic, organised, covered-up activity going on for many, many years. So there's two relatively senior Tory figures saying, whatever you've heard so far about Haiti or perhaps Chad is just the beginning of something very much bigger. And certainly evidence coming in that when missions go into poor countries, suddenly there are lots of 4x4 cars, the bars are busy, there's money in town, and all sorts of things do go on. But what interests me is, why has this been covered up to the extent that it has? And why do we continue, all of our leaders, to think that foreign aid is just so important? It was David Cameron who committed us to spending 0.7% of GDP on foreign aid every year, and indeed we do so. It is now £13.5 billion every single year that we give in foreign aid, and there's no sign, post-Cameron, of any of that culture changing. Indeed, Prime Minister Theresa May has described this target as a critical pillar of our country's foreign policy. And more extraordinarily, the new Development Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, said on Andrew Marr yesterday that she believes spending this £13.5 billion every year made Britain more prosperous. Now, it could well be that I'm just stupid. I don't know. But I fail to understand how giving this money, much of which it seems to me gets leached away in administrative costs, fraud, and indeed taken by rich people in poor countries and not where it's intended, has made us more prosperous. So I'm asking you tonight, in the wake of this Oxfam scandal, do we need to rethink the way that we spend our foreign aid budget? And if you think, no, Nigel, you're wrong, we have a moral obligation to go on doing this, then call me on 0345 6060 973. Or perhaps you think, like some backbench Tory MPs such as Philip Davis and Peter Bone, the money rather might be better spent here at home, in which case you can text to 84850. Or maybe, like me, you think the whole thing's a scam, in which case you can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. You can, of course, watch us on Facebook and comment there too. And my first caller of the evening is Robert, a new caller from Oldham. Good evening, Robert.
Good evening, Nigel.
So, do we need a rethink, Robert?
Yes, we do. because the 0.7% GDP target was only brought in, like he said, under David Cameron. Mm-hmm. That target has been in place since 1970, but it was only the Cameron government that brought it in.
Yes.
Now, you'll be aware that the Daily Express ran a Stop the Foreign Aid Madness campaign, and last week they went down to Downing Street to present a petition to Theresa May. Now, I was actually part of that delegation that went down. The Daily Express invited me.
Okay. And Robert, what is your role in all of this, then?
The Daily Express used my petition, which I put up on the government website, to abolish the target, because I think, as you've said, the money gets wasted. It doesn't go to the people it should do. I think the target should be abolished. It should be scaled back to 8.4 billion, and the money should be spent more accordingly. We can spend it on... We've got 9,000 armed forces who are homeless at the moment. We've got a problem with the NHS. Not only that, we've got problems with adult social care. So I would rather see a proportion of the money used towards the NHS, adult social care, and rehousing our homeless armed forces who've done so much for our country.
Robert, how big was that petition?
At the moment, it's 44,000.
Okay, right, fine.
And it needs to get to 100,000 by the 14th of March.
And then you get a parliamentary debate on that petition, yeah?
Parliamentary debate, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Robert, tell me, are you a cruel, cold-hearted person who doesn't care about the plight of those living in the third world?
No, I think we do have a duty of care, but I think we've also got a duty of care to the people that we look after at home. I think we do have a case to spend money abroad, but it needs to be spent more wisely, and we shouldn't be spending £13.4 billion. And I might add that figure rises if the economy improves.
I know. It's
16 billion by 2020.
That's right. It's a measure, isn't it? It's a measure. And there was a case a couple of years ago when our GDP growth for the year was bigger than the government had anticipated, and they had to spend £1 billion in 3 weeks, I was told, to make sure we kept up to the figure.
Crazy. It's not about being cruel. I mean, the government gets penalised because it's an arbitrary target.
Yeah.
They get into trouble if they don't spend the money. So they're under pressure, like he said, where they have to spend £1 billion in 3 weeks. Yep. Otherwise, they're in trouble. I would rather see the government, Theresa May, at the next election, because they can't do anything at the moment, go in with a pledge at the next election saying we will abolish the 0.7% GDP target and we'll spend the money at home on our priorities at home. We'll still spend some money on foreign aid, but we won't spend...
On a case-by-case basis.
It has to be done on a case-by-case.
No. And Robert, am I right in saying that we are currently the only Western world country spending this much on foreign aid?
I think we're the second highest, aren't we?
I think we are the second highest, and I think America, for example, spends 0.2%. I think was the last figure I saw, and certainly we spend more than Germany and pretty much everybody else. Robert, I thank you very much indeed for your call, and Robert there, who felt so motivated, he's even got a petition going on the subject. Fred is a new caller from Kennington. Good evening, Fred.
Good evening, Nigel. Thank you for taking my call.
Not a bit.
Thank you. Anyway, so the original question was, does the British economy benefit from the aid? And I'd say yes, due to the type of aid that we give. Now, I wouldn't argue that humanitarian aid is great, with whether it's vaccines and mosquito nets, but there are two types, humanitarian and development aid. Now, within that, there's a further two types, tied aid and untied aid. So how would we benefit from this? I mean, tied aid, for example, we would definitely benefit from. Now, I would argue that tied aid actually, does it benefit the recipient country, so the country that's receiving the aid, and not as much as it should, because, say, for example, the British government giving a lesser developed country aid. With the tied aid, they would have to then purchase British products. So it then goes back into our economic system instead of their own, which then you argue, what's the point of the aid?
Well, that would be yes, but I mean, Fred, doesn't that bring us to a bigger question? What is foreign aid? Is it about disaster relief? Is it about alleviating poverty? Is it about helping people who are suffering from many diseases of polio, malaria, and all of those things? Or is it, as the Prime Minister said, a critical pillar of the country's foreign policy? Is it, as Penny Mordaunt almost seems to suggest, when she says it makes Britain more prosperous, is it almost part of our sort of overseas investments? That's the question, Fred. What is it really for?
Well, exactly. Is it going towards the actual development of the country, or is it going for almost a vanity project of we spend 0.7% of our GDP, but are we looking at the results? We're just looking at the money spent. What has our overseas aid budget done? We'll be far better off in terms of development with trading with the nation, or even further than that.
Well, I think, Fred, the clue to helping some of these poorer countries may well be Brexit. Fred, I thank you for your call. And I'll come to that Brexit point in just a moment. But for me, why have we been given money to countries like India, who've got nuclear programs, who have had, warships with planes on them, aircraft carriers at times we haven't? Why have we been giving money to countries like Argentina, who've been busy purchasing jets and still have designs over the Falklands? Why have we even been giving money to North Korea? Seems to me there's not enough scrutiny here at all. Seems to me we've got to completely redefine what foreign aid is. I have got no problem giving money, I do myself sometimes, to disaster relief, an earthquake, a tsunami, something awful that has happened. But I'm struck that an annual cheque given to a country actually does not help them develop, does not help them get on, damages their credit rating and their chance themselves of getting onto their own 2 feet. I'm beginning to feel what I was told years ago cynically was right, that foreign aid is taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:15. The Oxfam scandal, the threat for their funding from government to be withdrawn, raises a much bigger question about the way we spend money on our foreign aid budget. I think this arbitrary figure is absolutely ridiculous and not serving its purpose. Thus far, with your messages, many of you seem to agree with me. The money should be spent here in our country. Charity begins at home, says Chris in East Sussex. Charity begins at home, says Sharon in Surrey. And a fantastic point here on Twitter, which I love. I did use it once myself back in the 2015 general election. Borrowing money to give abroad in the public name and then paying interest on that money, madness. Point being, we're running a budget deficit. We're borrowing. We have to borrow about 50 billion quid every single year. So we're giving money away in foreign aid. We're actually not just borrowing money to give some of that, we're having to pay interest on it. It's absolutely factually right. I also get on Twitter, the foolish idea that if the government saved foreign aid money, they would pass it on to the public is ludicrous. Well, there's no money there. We're borrowing it anyway. Now, I said earlier that I had a much better idea. We give money to poor countries, the third world, call them what you will. We do so to assuage our consciences. We do so because we certainly wouldn't want to let the public know the truth about the way we actually treat these countries, and particularly many in Black Africa. The biggest culprit of all of this in the world is the European Union. This protectionist club who, through their common external tariff, make it very difficult for those countries to sell us their goods, their green beans, or whatever it is. Why? Because we put massive tariffs on them through the common external tariff. If you really want to help the third world, if you really want to help Black Africa, back a clean Brexit campaign so that we as a country can reduce those barriers and enable those countries to start to trade their way out of poverty. Trade, not aid, is a way of guaranteeing genuine economic growth and some hope for those countries. And that's an argument you will not hear from anybody on the front benches of the Conservative and Labour Party. They're too frightened to admit just how awful the European Union has been, in particular to Africa, which it begins to treat rather like a colony. I'm going to go to Robin in Whitehaven in Cumbria, and I'm going to ask him, do we need to rethink the way the foreign aid budget is spent, Robin?
I think, Nigel, a lot of what you say sometimes is truthful and very sensible, but my biggest fear about this crisis with the charity workers abusing the positions is that we shouldn't let that be a reason and an excuse to cut money that we give as foreign aid and charity, because some of the most desperate people in the world need that, and that's what keeps them alive. So we mustn't let the small minority of people who have abused their positions to influence government in stop and give money, and also people who give themselves personally to charities. We shouldn't let conflict the two, because that's a very serious danger that people are going to lose out, and eventually they'll lose their lives if they don't get the aid that's needed. But we mustn't let that be.
Well, Robin, Great Ormond Street gave back a whole chunk of money after knowing that a lot of it was raised by the President's Club, which caused a storm. So there are questions about this. But Robin, I mean, we've got a virtual admission here from, the Deputy Chief Executive of Oxfam. She basically says, look, I'm resigning because allegations were made and we simply didn't deal with them. And Robin, you may think I'm being a bit too suspicious, but when I see that statement, and I also see what Priti Patel, the ex-Development Secretary, says, and I add to that what one of Boris Johnson's aides, Conor Burns, says, and I begin to see a picture here that anything that's gone wrong has been covered up. I begin to think, Robin, it's because there's so much money in that sector and such good pay and conditions for those that work in it. Am I being too cynical?
No, I think there is some charities where the wages that the charity workers, the organisers get when you give to charity, I think there should be 100% of that goes to charity. There shouldn't be bits taken off to pay for chief executives of charities' wages and whatever else, you know what I mean? So that certainly does need looked at. But I can understand I can understand why they didn't want it out in the public domain, what had went on, for the fear that people would stop giving to charities. I think that was the only possible reason, that the fear that people will stop giving to charity. That's why I think, because I can't imagine these people doing it.
Well, the fear that people would stop giving to the charities and they in turn would suffer as well. So there's a little bit of both there, Robin, isn't there, really?
Well, there is as well. There is, I suppose. But, well, like I said, Nigel, you can't use this, and people shouldn't use this as an excuse to cut aid to...
All right, Robin, just lastly, and I know, thank you, you've put that view very clearly. Just lastly, do you support the target of 0.7% per annum?
Honestly, Nigel, I don't know whether you should have a set amount, because there's different crises all over the world which will need a different amount. So they should have a charity committee that will come together, and then they'll decide an amount and look at how the books settle in this country. Then they can say, well, that country needs more for this.
Okay.
So, you know what I mean? Rather than having a set amount.
Yeah, no, well, I think, Robin, the one thing we can all agree on, whatever our attitude towards the foreign aid budget, is tying it to GDP figures, where forecasts, of course, are always wrong, and finishing up having to spend an extra £1 billion in the last 3 weeks of the financial year is clearly a nonsense. Robin, thank you, and a plea from Robin saying, don't ditch the whole aid budget because of the bad behaviour of some people who work for Oxfam. Paul is calling from Guildford, a new caller to the show. Good evening, Paul.
Hello there, you all right?
I'm all right. So tell me something. When Penny Mordaunt tells us it makes Britain more prosperous, is she right?
Majority of what she says is right, and the only reason I know this is because I used to work for Safeways. Years ago, we actually ran a number of lorries packaged with equipment over to Bosnia when the conflict was over in there, and the government provided the funding for that. So a lot of things like, for example, people keep on going on about why we give it to India when they've got a nuclear program, is because when you give the money to them, they will specify that English companies are on the contract, so we actually get the money back. North Korea is a different one. That's political, so we're giving them money so that we can establish political relationship, which, to be honest, is what you should know anyway, because we do that a lot with countries. Even India is a political thing. It's not necessarily we're giving them money because they can afford to do it themselves. In
fact, Paul, what you're saying, and I suspect you're right, is that actually the foreign aid budget now is an extension of soft power in terms of foreign policy, and is directly linked to trade and imports and exports.
So when she says we are actually making our country more prosperous, the reason for that is because companies, for example, like Safeways are getting the money, paying their staff, pay tax, so on and so forth.
So wouldn't it be more honest to say, actually, it's not the foreign aid budget, we're using it as a form of bribery to bribe other countries to do business with us?
More or less, yeah.
Yeah,
That's exactly it. It's diplomatic. It's we give you money, you give us something back. That's all it is. It's just you shake my hand, I'll shake yours.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Safeways weren't doing that, of course, Paul. But now listen, good point, Paul. And actually, I've heard William Hague make arguments over the past few years defending the foreign aid budget, as indeed virtually the whole of the front benches in Westminster do. And I've heard this argument, but it's not an argument for foreign aid. It's not an argument for humanitarian relief. It's an argument to support some of Britain's businesses. Whether it actually works or not, I simply do not know. John says on Facebook, my son, a Royal Marine, and his regiment were sent to the Caribbean to help after the hurricane. That's the only assistance we should give. And John, I've said it before, I'll say it again. When it comes to hurricanes, when it comes to tsunamis, when it comes to earthquakes and people in real trouble, I think we should help. And you know something? We almost don't need the government to help, because when these things happen, the British public give generously. They give huge tens of millions of pounds to all of these disaster relief projects. Rick says we should send aid in the form of medicines, food and clothing only. No cash or money should change hands. Rick, I think you're right, and I think we actually need to say, look, if this is the foreign aid budget, it's about aid. It's not to implement our own foreign policy. It's not part of our trade policy. They should be separate things and be a bit more frank and honest with people. I wonder what Desmond in Camden thinks. Good evening, Desmond.
Good evening to you, sir. Well, I did a cursory check on some statistics.
Yeah.
And apparently Oxfam employ about 5,000 people directly and have about 20,000 people as volunteers.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so out of that, consider some other statistics that it's apparently the case that 3% of men have paedophilic tendencies, apparently. And about
I'd question that, Desmond, but go on.
Okay. 7% of UK men have paid for sex. In other countries, worst case scenarios, Haiti and not Haiti, Cambodia and Thailand,
right.
70 to 80% have paid for sex.
Right.
You will have inevitably, and any company that employs people will inevitably have people who are awful.
Yep.
And Oxfam sacked these people, and they got others to resign. What more could they?
Well, on the face of it, Desmond,
have done?
On the face of it, Desmond, what you say is quite logical, and I couldn't disagree with it. And yet, we hear government ministers telling us what we've seen so far is the tip of the iceberg. Hints, as I say, that it may well involve illegal sexual activity with minors, and, Desmond, the fact that it's been covered up. And I think, the resignation note of Penny Lawrence does say, that concerns were raised about the behaviour of our staff in Chad as well as Haiti, and we failed to act adequately upon it. Desmond, logical point, but I suspect there's more to it than that. At least it feels that way to me. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 7:30. A huge scandal over Oxfam, a threat for the government to stop their funding. But no proper debate that I can discern going on about whether we should go on spending £13.5 billion every single year on the foreign aid budget. Because nobody in Westminster, at least on the front benches, wants to talk about it because they all agree, they all think it's a great thing. Some say we're fulfilling a great humanitarian mission. Others suggest, and Penny Mordaunt, the Development Secretary, suggests it makes Britain more prosperous, suggesting actually foreign aid is being used for commercial purposes and foreign policy purposes, not humanitarian relief. But before I get back to that, US President Donald Trump has today unveiled his plan for a revamp of what he's called the crumbling US infrastructure. And any of you that have, perhaps in the last few years, flown into New York and travelled in on those roads can see exactly what he's talking about. Trump wants Congress to authorise $200 billion over the next decade to spend on roads, highways, ports and airports to be offset by federal budget savings. The president hopes that the US states and the private sector will stimulate a further $1.3 trillion. The numbers are just crackers, really, aren't they? No, $1.3 trillion in improvements. Now, remember, this was an election promise, and whether you like or loathe Donald Trump, the one thing he keeps trying to do is put big ticks against his manifesto, against the pledges that he made to people. Now, if all this comes to pass, yeah, it'll mean higher local taxes. It'll mean fees and tolls on bridges and roads. Trump, of course, always wanted to try and make a point, tweeted that it was time for the US to invest in itself after stupidly spending $7 trillion in the Middle East. And he's referring to those very lengthy wars that America and the United Kingdom have been engaged in since 2001. Watch this space. I do actually think, as I say, when it comes to cities like New York, they desperately need new roads and a revamped infrastructure. But back to this foreign aid budget, back to my feeling that actually, if we really wanted to help poor countries, and Black Africa in particular, we would do it by helping them to trade. David on Twitter makes a brilliant point, I think. He says, give a man a fish and he will eat for a day. Teach a man how to fish and he will eat forever. Don't give money to them, teach them how to make money. And I agree with that, David. It's called, intermediate technology, introducing skills. A country like Ghana, for example, that produces a lot of cocoa, tends to export a lot of cocoa. Trouble is, the international price of cocoa, and I was a commodity broker once, I had a real job, the price of cocoa goes up and it goes down. They get good years and bad years. But actually the real value added in all commodities is not in selling the raw material, it's making something out of the cocoa, because that's where the real money is. And I do think there is so much more we could do for these countries, rather than, in so many cases, giving money to their governments who appear to abuse much of it. Ali is calling from Hounslow. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Are you shocked by this Oxfam scandal or not?
No. I'm not surprised, because I'm from the Horn of Africa.
Yep.
I have two nationalities. I'm from Ethiopia as well as Somalia.
Okay.
And whenever I visit back home, it's not surprising you'll find hotel lobby rooms, car rentals, prices go up, there's midnight parties taking place, and we all know what's happening in there, but I don't want to divulge in that in too much. But I agree with your policy in terms of UK government has to scrap this program of giving aid to these NGO charities, and Britain should scrap it and put money into either they should have direct infrastructure investment, which China is adopting in Africa. And if you go to Ethiopia, you notice in dramatic changes. Our economy is rapidly developing. We were the fastest growing economy in Africa due to the policy of direct infrastructure development. Is that what Donald Trump is trying to implement in America?
Very interesting.
And it's creating unbelievable, countless numbers of jobs. Exactly what you said, we're moving into the value addition part of the value chain. Jobs are being created, and Ethiopia has clearly abandoned this program of and really restricting NGOs, and there's dramatic differences taking place in Ethiopia. But whenever I go to Somalia, the other place of my origin, I'm noticing hotels are being sprung up to cater for these NGOs. It's creating inflation whenever I visit my local town. Because of this aid money flow, where 80% of it is being deducted for so-called administrative PowerPoint presentation, and yet it's still endemic with poverty, extreme poverty, and that's why you're seeing local people from that area traveling across the Sahara Desert, trying to enter Europe, whilst in the neighbouring state of Ethiopia, unbelievable economic growth.
Well, Ali, that's really interesting, because one of the arguments for foreign aid is we throw money at poor countries in the form of foreign aid, and that means they won't leave and come across the Mediterranean. But actually what you've seen at first hand is actually not much of the money is reaching the right place, is it?
Absolutely. And make a comparison. Look at UK aid money and look at Chinese aid money into Africa, and you will notice the difference. You notice the unbelievable economic changes it's taking place in Rwanda, in Ethiopia, because they're adopting the policies of Deng Xiaoping of China, of Singapore. You want to create development, create jobs, and yet when you look at the system, what UK is funding money to corrupt regimes.
And Ali, when you've seen, as you have at first hand, the NGOs with big money in Ethiopia and elsewhere, I mean, would you describe the whole thing as being somewhat corrupt? Is that why they covered it up for years?
Absolutely. You just do Google search, and if you provide me your email, I can send you some actual evidence of corruption. It's corrupting the society. There's a surge of prostitution that takes place in the area when that flow of NGO so-called consultancy money comes over, when these consultants come over, and it's there. It's evidence in the
Ali, I tell you what, go to lbc.co.uk, get that information through to me. Great phone call. I was going to say phone call of the week. It's only Monday, but that was a great phone call and very insightful, and thank you. And I thought it was really interesting, the point he was making about the way the Chinese do this compared to the way we do it. Fascinating. Ralph is a new caller from Reigate in Surrey. Good evening, Ralph.
Hi, good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well. So, come on, tell me I'm wrong. Tell me every penny we spend is great value and doing huge good.
I don't think so. I actually agree with your previous caller. I think the main question or the main point of discussion we have to be having is, I think everyone agrees that just pouring money into this situation is not helping anything at all. More importantly, I think it's how can we enforce or at least help these countries which have really, really weak institutions, in terms of if we did donate money, if you do give money, it either goes to NGO firms, not all of them, but a few really hammer on the PR, to guilt trip the public. But the second aspect is sort of these weak institutions that just mop up all the funds. Really, these corrupt politicians just mop up all the funds. So how can one play a part from here in terms of creating more democratic countries and also having strong institutions there?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer, is it? Of course it's not. And as you say, a lot of these countries are deeply unstable. But we should not allow our money to be filtered into corruption that may keep them unstable for longer than they need to.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree on that. And there was another. I think there was a caller called Paul, and he had a very interesting point in that sometimes it feels like we have to make compromises just because of the level of trade we have in these parts of the world.
Yes, I know. But shouldn't we, in that case, then, Ralph, be more honest about this and not call it the foreign aid budget?
I fully agree with that. I fully agree with that. We have to also be transparent in how we're engaging with these parts of the world, and we're not reasoned as well.
Yeah, we're not. Ralph, I thank you for the call. And a classic example of where it all goes wrong is, and back to my friends the European Union, their overseas third world fisheries policy, where they give money to African countries to allow European vessels to go and fish in their waters. It is relatively unpoliced. In environmental terms, much of what's happened off Mauritania and West Africa is a disaster, and I've spoken about it, and I've campaigned against it, and I've flown over parts of Africa and taken photographs of all this going on. Thousands of local artisan fishermen have directly been killed as a result of this, lost their livelihoods as a result of this, and yet the argument made is, oh no, Nigel, don't criticise it, we're giving money to poor countries, they should be really pleased. Oh no, they shouldn't. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:45. Is the $13.5 billion we're spending on foreign aid every year bringing great benefits to the countries we give it to, and indeed, as Development Secretary Penny Mordaunt claims, to us as a country as well? And I want to get back to that in one moment. But for now, UKIP. Big week for UKIP, difficult week for UKIP. Extraordinary general meeting takes place this Saturday in Birmingham. This is after UKIP leader Henry Bolton unanimously lost the confidence of the party's NEC. So this EGM will decide, does Bolton stay, does he go? And this afternoon we learn that Paul Oakden, the party chairman, will be stepping down from his role, and that'll happen this Saturday. So Yeah, yet more instability, yet more turbulence. Why is Paul Oakton stepping down? Well, I think the honest truth is the party doesn't really have the funds to pay him properly to do the job. And, you know, he's not a particularly old guy. He's got to kind of get on with his life. But it's part of the difficulty, the problems that UKIP's had over the course of the last 18 months or so. Saturday will be a very dramatic day for all those that attend, and I've no doubt the media will absolutely love the spectacle. Chambers on Facebook says to me, I do not consent to my tax money going abroad. I do not authorise the government to do this. Well, tough luck, matey. It's been decided that 0.7% every year is going to be spent. Cameron was the first Prime Minister to keep us to it, and Mrs May intends that we stay there as well, and you won't get Jeremy Corbyn opposing it either. On Twitter, I get trade, not aid, a comment that I made earlier. David in Hereford says, could it be that part of the overseas aid is slush money used to grease the palms of foreign politicians who agree to buy our products? Keeps our workers in work and makes the government look good. Well, that's fine if we think bribery is the right way to do this. So let's rebrand it and call it the foreign bribery budget. And I'm sure as soon as we do that, there'll be howls of outrage from everybody saying that this is simply monstrous. But David Edwards from Hereford, your point is a good one, that actually we think of foreign aid as being humanitarian help and relief, and we do see clues from our Prime Minister and our Development Secretary, and indeed William Hague when he was Foreign Secretary, that in fact, in many ways this money is used for different purposes. George is calling from Loughborough. Good evening, George.
Hello, Nigel.
So, new caller to the show, George. Do you feel strongly in favour of our foreign aid budget?
I do need to be honest. Simply, I think the problem is like it's been kind of said, the definition of foreign aid.
Yes.
I seem to think that foreign aid is what we should be seeing on the ground. The money shouldn't be going anywhere but there. Obviously, the problem is that money gets tied up with corrupt politicians and all sorts. So what kind of really needs to be sorted out is the route that we get the money there. I don't think there's any problem with the amount allocated. I think that's fine, and perhaps in certain circumstances that could be altered or even added to if need be. I think foreign aid is a very important thing if we're talking about the right sort of foreign aid and the stuff that we should be seeing on the ground helping people out.
Okay, George, I understand the point you're making. I mean, are you comfortable with us giving foreign aid to countries that have got nuclear weapons, the countries that have got, you know, big military programs? Should we be giving foreign aid to countries like that?
Yes, because it's not the country that I personally would give foreign aid to. It's the people in that country who kind of class that country as the third world, because they're the ones suffering and require the foreign aid. It's not the person with their button on a nuclear weapon that the foreign aid should be going to. It's the people who really need it. It's the people on the streets. It's the children in sex work, etc.
Yes, I understand that point, and very pertinent perhaps to what's being discussed with this current scandal. But yeah. George, are you happy that several £1 million a year has been going to projects in North Korea?
I mean, again, it's the same point.
Yeah, okay.
North Korea or not. The problem is, I agree, the money gets held up with the people who have those nuclear weapons in North Korea. There would be absolutely no problem if it went to the people in North Korea who actually need that money.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what race you are. If you need help, we should be a country who are happy to give that help.
George, you are making the humanitarian argument for foreign aid to be used to help people, as opposed to being a way of abetting British trade or being a sort of soft power part of our foreign policy. As someone who cares about this, and clearly you do, how do you feel today about Oxfam?
Well, it's just kind of a big disappointment, and it clearly kind of shows that big business, essentially, and even big aid charities are not the answer to supporting foreign aid. It needs to be done through smaller channels, perhaps. OK. And do you think the government would be right to withhold the £30 million plus a year they currently give to Oxfam? That's a hard call, because... I know.
I've put you on the spot. It's very unfair of me.
It goes a lot of ways because, as it's been talked about a lot, it's the minority of people, we'd hope, who are holding that, who are causing the damage there. And Oxfam obviously have done and do a lot of good. So, in principle, I wouldn't want to completely slash it, no. But I feel if that's the only thing that could happen.
You're conflicted, George. George, you're conflicted, and I asked you live on LBC a very unfair question, but I get your general point. You care about the aid budget, and I thank you for your call. And George, I think typical of people who themselves give money. They give money for disaster relief. They give out of their own pockets for genuine humanitarian aid, help, and support. But I just feel this budget has now become incredibly politicised. I wonder what Steve, a new caller from Lewis, makes of that comment. Good evening, Steve.
Hi, Nigel. Thanks for having me on.
Not a bit.
My comment is I think we're not being nearly generous enough. I think the figure of 0.7% was mentioned.
Yep.
I think it should be more like 2 or 3%.
Right.
A lot of people say, this money should be spent on the UK, but I think we've developed a culture in this country of give me, give me, give me, give me. People have the opportunities here to do what they want, get what they want, and there's a lot of other countries in the world where that's not possible. So I think 0.7% is pathetic.
All right.
It should be more like 2 or 3.
So, Steve, that would be just to give the sort of listeners a handle. You're talking about 40 to 50 billion pounds every year, yeah?
Yes. But I can't do the maths, but that must mean that, the country's income is 200 or 300 billion or 1,000 billion, even though we've got a massive national debt. But
we do.
My main point is what I think Oxfam and Save the Children and charities like that have become too big and too bloated. They obviously don't have control over what's going on. But what I think should happen is that every rich country, i.e. us and most European countries, Canada, America, the UN should say to the UK, you are responsible for this country.
Well, I'm sure, Steve, some of these charities are doing the job very, very well. But, Steve, like so many things in life, just throwing money at something doesn't really guarantee much of a result. And Steve, let me ask you, Steve, because this is one of the big things that's come out over this last hour is, do you want the money spent on helping poor people, or do you see the foreign aid budget, as I think our Prime Minister and our Development Secretary do, basically as an extension of our foreign policy and our trade policy?
No, I'm 100% to help poor people, but the point I want to get across is that I think the government and all governments fritter this money away on all these different charities, and I think a rich Western country like Britain should be given the responsibility of looking after one poor country, and all our resources and our expertise and our clever people concentrate on that.
All right, Steve, you've made your point, and I thank you. I suspect Steve's view that we should increase the budget to 40 or 50 billion sterling every year puts him in a very small minority. But hey, that's what open debate's about. We can all have our say. I think the 0.7% target is absolutely ludicrous. I've no confidence the money's being spent properly. Comment here I get. Nigel, if we're giving all this money to these charities, why do they go on TV asking for more and more? Well, it's like the joke, isn't it? The guy wins the football pools. The wife says, what are you going to do about the begging letters? He says, well, I'm just going to keep sending them. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here at LBC. I'm back tomorrow at 7. Tonight at 10, it's Ian Collins. But up next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you. So coming up at 9, the Business Hour. And joining me this week is Mike Souter, chairman of Shortlist and one of Lord Sugar's interviewers for The Apprentice. He's going to be here to offer advice to budding entrepreneurs and take questions about how to grow your business. That's at 9. Also later, commuters in London could be hit with fare rises. As it emerges, TfL faces a budget deficit of up to £1 billion. Why is this happening? We'll explain later. And first, Windsor Council